Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton expects running back Javonte Williams to be ready for the start of training camp, but if he's not, could they look at Dalvin Cook? What does the running back room look like? You're going to get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. And shout out to all the everyday listeners out there in Broncos Country. Subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss out on an episode as soon as it's made available. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, credentialed Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, my good friend, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert at predominantlyorange.com. Javonte Williams, Broncos Country received some good news over the weekend surrounding the expected status of him heading into July's training camp portion. According to Sean Payton, he believes he's going to be ready to go. And Sayre, if he is truly, in fact, ready to go, this is a big step forward for the Broncos offense, a newly renovated Broncos offense under the direction of Sean Payton. I'm excited for it. I think Broncos Country is as well.
Yeah, and rightfully so, because it would be nothing short of absolutely game-changing for the Denver Broncos in many facets, many ways. I think we've kind of been getting pulled all different directions this offseason when it comes to Javonte Williams, haven't we? It was like, well, don't get too optimistic. He may not even be ready for the start of the season. And then George Paton, I think it was at the scouting combine, right? He came out and he said, well, there's a chance he could be ready at the beginning of the season, potentially week 1. And so then everybody's all excited, like, yes, Javonte Williams ready week 1. That was, it's unexpected news. And then you kind of back off that about a month later, right? Kind of say, well, it could be this, it could be that. Maybe feel like it's not going to be the very start of the season. We've been getting pulled back and forth from, hey, he may be ready for the start of the season to don't count on Javonte Williams for, maybe even the first half of the season, maybe this year at all. And now Sean Payton comes out and says he may not even be on the PUP to start training camp. It's a big difference of the things that we're talking about, the timelines that we're talking about, Cody. These are not like a week or two off. These are like 2 months off or 4 months off. It's like it's such a whirlwind of excitement one way, and then just like, okay, we got to go sign a guy the other direction, right? So it's hard to know exactly where to land in terms of what we should expect. I guess we'll just have to kind of wait and see once training camp kicks off there in July where Javonte Williams actually is at that point. But to me, the tone of Sean Payton in this interview that he did with the press after, the minicamp, the rookie minicamp, his tone to me indicated a bit of a surprising diagnosis over the last couple months of where Javonte's recovery process is at. This didn't sound to me, I know a lot of people are like, well, is this just coach speak, or is this just him just coming out there and saying something? No, I think he sounded like genuinely like, hey, this wasn't what we expected, but this is what it is. This is what's happening. So I don't know. I'm not taking this necessarily even with a grain of salt. I kind of taken him at his word on this, that Javonte could be ready at the start of camp.
Well, and I think it's important as well. Sean Payton has always been, historically throughout his career, I've even asked Ross Jackson, our good friend over there, Locked On Saints podcast, and our channel coordinator here on the NFL side of things for the Locked On Podcast Network. I asked him before, once Sean Payton was initially hired, hey, what are some things to expect? What are some things that he says in press conferences that we should pick up on? And he said he usually will not give you injury updates on guys. And Payton even said, normally we're very tight-lipped on this. But one thing he did say in terms of he talks to Bo Lowry every single day. He gets the reports from him and says, hey, it's very promising. But he also said this as well. He says, normally we're very tight-lipped on matters like this. So I think that maybe it's just him putting it out there as well, not only just to help the optics of maybe where Denver's at, but also for Javonte, right? Because, look, here's the thing with all the uncertain timelines that we've had thrown out and, all these Twitter medical professionals that have come out and said, oh, he's going to be out for another year. He's not even going to play this season. The reality of the situation is the people that need to know. And that's fine, and that's good. I know that we all want, especially us in the media, we want to know, like, okay, what's the real legitimate timeline so we can maybe project in our head what the roster is going to look like at training camp, what it's going to look like maybe week one. That stuff will all come in time. But, for Javonte, he's attacked rehab very aggressively. He's been in the building doing that. And I think it's good for Javonte at this point, right? Because, look, all these reports coming out, Denver should sign this back. Denver should sign this back. I mean, as a player, that would get to me personally. I'd take that a little personal, seeing these things from fans, because, look, a lot of fans have written Javonte off for this season, and that's just because there's uncertainty and there's not a lot of knowledge about what the true timeline is for him. I do express Broncos fans to be patient. Hey, look, and if he's not ready, as Sean Payton said, if he's not ready, he'll go on the PUP list, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we have to really highlight that there. But I think another thing that stood out to me about what Sean Payton told us after Saturday's practice was he's very comfortable with the group of running backs that are currently in the room right now on the roster getting ready to head into training camp. So if Sean Payton is happy, if Sean Payton is comfortable and confident with that, Sayre, should Denver be, should they just proceed forward as is if Javonte is ready or isn't ready?
Well, I think that's the big question right now, right? Because we'll see what happens after June 1, what kind of players become available. I know we're going to talk about that later in the show, but it kind of reminds me, Cody, as we're talking about this whole thing, I want to go back to a quote that Sean Payton said about, do you have enough running backs on the roster, right? And he said, obviously, I think we have a few here that we're looking at during this camp. I feel really good about our group of veterans, which speaks to what you're saying here, that are already in the building. And here's the comment that I think really gives me confidence about Javonte Williams. I think everybody needs to listen into. When we signed Samaje, this is a guy that gives us flexibility. We know that he can play and be an every down back. Our current starter, Javonte Williams, of course, is doing extremely well. I would tell you we expect him to be ready for the start of training camp, and that's good news. His rehab is going well. So it's this context here of when we signed this player, right? That he said later on, when we signed him, there was still uncertainty regarding Samaje Perine. That quote right there, Cody, gives me a little bit of like, okay, this isn't just, like I said, it's not just coach speak. It's actually him saying we have confidence in Javonte coming back. But the guys behind him, the fans don't know much about him. We don't know much. We didn't see a ton of Samaje Perine with the Bengals. We didn't see a ton of Tony Jones Jr. with the New Orleans Saints. We got to see just a glimpse of Tyler Beatty last year with the Denver Broncos even. So we don't know a ton of what's behind these guys. But for Sean Payton and the Broncos to be confident there, I think that's the key, right? Because they're going to run the ball a lot this season. That's why I think people are saying, go sign this guy, go sign that guy. Because if you're going to run the ball a lot, Sean Payton on the one hand is talking about, well, I've have a history of, finding undrafted free agents. 15 years, we were number one in the league in terms of bringing those guys in. On the other hand, he's like, I was always taught to stack up this position, So it's like this tension between, do we go with what he's saying of these unproven guys and say, all right, yeah, the unproven guys, they're going to get the job done in terms of running the ball a lot this season. And on the other hand, it's like, I've always learned to stack the position, right? So are you going to trust him one way or the other? Is it a both? And do you feel like they've done this combination of bringing in the unproven guys, bringing in the veteran guys? I think there's an understandable tension there in terms of when you look at the Broncos depth chart, the proven depth at running back.
And we'll see how it all plays out for NFL training camp. There are some potential dominoes that could fall down if, in fact, Javonte is not ready. Could that include Dalvin Cook? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, Broncos Country. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. You have the conference finals beginning on the NBA side of things with the Nuggets and the Lakers, the Heat, and the Celtics. FanDuel is the place to be. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Could the Denver Broncos sign Pro Bowl running back Dalvin Cook at some point this offseason if he becomes available? Cody, there's rumors that the Minnesota Vikings could potentially be looking to let Dalvin Cook go. Actually, these rumors have been extending back to trade rumors. Last year, I remember reading some stuff And you hear trade rumors, even some during the season a little bit. I don't know. The writing maybe seems to be on the wall for Dalvin Cook in Minnesota. There's an obvious connection here with George Paton, who was, of course, part of the Minnesota Vikings front office when they drafted Dalvin Cook. And the running back position has historically been very important to both Sean Payton and George Paton in terms of how they construct their teams. So I pose this question to you. We know we want to let Russ cook in 2023, right? But is it time for Dalvin Cook to be a potential option for the Denver Broncos?
I think everything has to be contingent upon, if something happens, right? I look at where Denver's at right now. I mean, Sayre, Denver's got 8 running backs right now on paper going into training camp, including Javonte, right? So you have Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, Demarie Crockett, who was dazzling a little bit in training camp last year before suffering a torn ACL. Tony Jones Jr., who you got in free agency. Jaquez Patrick, a tryout player who obviously impressed over the weekend to sign a contract to be on the 90-man roster. Tyler Beatty coming back. You have Emmanuel Wilson and Jaleel McLaughlin, the undrafted rookie free agent running backs. And I'll tell you this, looking at that running back room, there's kind of a formula. There's like a prototype in terms of what Denver is getting from that position. And it's a combination of some guys who have speed, but I think a lot of it is bulkiness, right? The ability to maybe be able to sustain a lot of contact throughout the season, good size, good body types in there in that running back room going into training camp. And I think you have to ask yourself this question, okay, if right, Javonte Williams will not be ready for training camp and may not be ready for the start of the season, then I would say yes. But considering what Sean Payton has said over the course of this weekend, and if in fact Javonte is truly ready, Sayre, in my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to go out there and sign Dalvin Cook at this point in time because of the fact that in free agency, you went and you got Perine. I mean, here's the reality. Unless Denver was like, all right, even if Javonte is ready, we're going to sign Dalvin Cook as a because he's going to be a post-June 1st designated cut by the Minnesota Vikings, more than likely. We're going to bring him into Denver, and we're just going to have a 3 running back-led committee by Javonte, Dalvin, and Samaje Perine. I wouldn't be opposed to that, but then at the same time, you're also sacrificing potential development of guys like Beatty, guys like, Emmanuel Wilson, Jaleel McLaughlin, maybe some guys that you see promise in down the road. So what is the opportunity cost here for the Broncos offense? Of course, Dalvin Cook is it's the sexy name, right? Everyone wants to go sign the sexy name, but does it make sense for where the Broncos are at right now? I'm curious for your thoughts on this, Sayre.
Yeah, I think, let's say, Cody, we get done with this episode and the Broncos somehow find a way to, I know they're not doing it today, but let's say they sign Dalvin Cook today. And the question is, are you going to be mad about that? Absolutely not. I mean, it would be cool to see Dalvin Cook in Denver. It would be cool to, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that's just like, okay, it's a good player added to the roster. And the idea of that is exciting, right? But at the same time, like you mentioned, you look at this from the perspective of who the Broncos currently have. You look at, guys that are trying to invest in their development, and you look at Javonte Williams, the update on his health. If that is a true and honest report of his health, which I believe it is, Cody, I don't see the path for, let's look at this from Dalvin Cook's perspective. Does he want to come to Denver where they promised Samaje Perine a bigger role, where now Javonte Williams seems to be on the path to becoming ready for training camp? I just don't know. If I'm Dalvin Cook, I might be looking for a clearer path to those bell cow level carries City,
and
stuff.
Los Angeles, the Raiders.
Can you imagine?
Golly.
Can you imagine? Hey, maybe you just made the best case for the Broncos signing Dalvin Cook right there. But hey, I agree with you in terms of the roster as it currently is. You look at it from Dalvin Cook's perspective, I just don't see it making sense for him to come to Denver and say, oh, yeah, I'll take 12, carries a game or something like that to play in that. I don't think he's doing anybody any favors like that. These guys get 1 or 2 shots to make the most possible money. And if Dalvin Cook is getting only 12 to 15 touches a game because that whole backfield is healthy, that's not going to make him the most possible money, in my opinion. I just don't see that happening. So he's going to look for that path, that opportunity to make the most possible money if he does get cut by the Vikings. And I don't blame him for that. He's a running back. Running backs are unfortunately underpaid in today's NFL because the teams cycle through them so quickly. So, and he's obviously an example of that. And so I think that it's one of those things where it's like, is the timing right? If like you said, if the Broncos didn't have Samaje Perine, I think it would be a no-brainer. But since they have Samaje Perine and now the positive health update on Javonte Williams, just don't know if it makes sense.
I've been watching a lot of Ballers lately on HBO, and I just keep thinking in my head, what would Spencer Strasmore tell Dalvin Cook in this situation? Where do you want to go, right? Because when you look at it, yeah, I think you outlined a great case like, hey, if Javonte's ready and you have Perine, it doesn't make sense for Dalvin Cook to want to come to Denver because it just depends on maybe what his motivations are. Is it money? Is it, playing for a contender? I mean, I could see Dalvin Cook maybe taking the risk of maybe taking less money to go play for a contender. But let's be honest here, that's not Denver yet. So who is that? I mean, it could be the Kansas City Chiefs who for some reason load up on everybody and everybody wants to go there to win a ring because it's their best opportunity. Could we see him maybe go to Philadelphia? Could we see him end up in Dallas? I mean, there's all these possibilities. Yeah, Miami. I mean, Mike McDaniel loves his running backs there. So Denver, I think when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, while fans maybe really, really, really want a guy like Dalvin Cook because he's the sexy name, there's obviously some familiarity, some ties to Denver in terms of George Payton, but ultimately it has to make sense for the team. It also has to make sense for the player. Often at times, if these two things are not like mutually exclusive, it never works out. And I think that Denver right now, with where they're at, with the 8 running backs that they have right now on the roster, I mean, Sayre, 8 running backs on your 90-man roster. That's typically abnormal. You don't normally see it. You usually see like 4 or 5 at training camp. There's 8 going into July's festivities. So I think it is important to maybe make note of that here for anybody that is watching or listening as well. Broncos Country, we always want your thoughts. We want your opinions on the subject matter as well. When it comes to Dalvin Cook, is it a pipe dream for Broncos fans? Or is it realistic? We always want you to share your thoughts. Drop it in the YouTube comments down below. Or if you're listening on your favorite podcasting provider, make sure you drop us a line on Twitter at Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But we are going to play a scenario in our head here, Broncos Country, on today's episode of the show. If Javonte is not ready for the start of training camp, what is the move at running back? You're going to get that on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. Real quick, let me tell you about our partnership with SiriusXM. If you listen to Locked On Broncos every single day on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spotify, well, guess what? You can now catch us in the SiriusXM app. So if you have the app and you listen to that every day to listen to radio, you can now catch Locked On Broncos inside your SiriusXM app. And then once the season rolls around, there'll be some special promotions where Sayre and I, we go on SiriusXM radio to talk Broncos as well. So make sure you check it out. If you have the SiriusXM app, you can now listen to Locked On Broncos every single day. If, in fact, Javonte Williams is not ready for the start of training camp or suffers a setback of any kind, what will the Broncos do at running back in training camp? What is the move potentially for the regular season if we were to project it? You're going to get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Real quick, just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country. Thank you for taking time out of your day to listen or to watch us break down all things Denver Broncos here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Thanks for making us your first listen of the day every single day. We're grateful for you, whether you're an everyday listener or whether you're a casual fan who tunes in 1 to 3 times a week. We want to try to get you to bump that up to listen to every single day all year long because we truly have you covered with all things orange and blue. Sayre, let's kind of open up this conversation here, right? Obviously, there was the dynamic of what Sean Payton did tell us during Saturday's press conference. He did say, and if he's not ready, we'd expect him to go on the PUP list, but we hope that he doesn't end up on the PUP list, right? The physically unable to perform, it holds him out of, action for some time. If that is, in fact, the move here for the Broncos, right? Just throwing a hypothetical out there. What do you see the Broncos doing at the position? Because I've kind of found it interesting as well that Sean Payton said when describing Samaje Perine that he can be an every down back for the team. That is the vision for him as a player.
Yeah, he would be the running back one, wouldn't he? As far as going into training camp with the depth chart, if Javonte Williams does start on the PUP, this would be a running game that flows through Samaje Perine. And I think you would get a very true committee approach in that regard. I don't necessarily know that we would see Perine get 25 touches a game or anything like that. I think that would open things up for the younger players on this depth chart to really come out and show, hey, I deserve some touches. And I go back to a couple of things that Sean Payton said throughout the offseason. Something that he said a month or two ago. He was talking about, I think the last starting running back that you guys had, referring to the Broncos in a Super Bowl, was an undrafted free agent. And he was referring to, of course, CJ Anderson. And then at the post-rookie minicamp press conference, he told the story about how in 2007, they drafted a guy out of Ohio State. He didn't even say the guy's name. I guess I don't know who it is off the top of my head either,
I'll have to go
Cody.
back and look.
But he said, Yeah, we have to go back and look. But he said we drafted a guy out of Ohio State in the 4th round, and we signed this guy, Pierre Thomas, in undrafted free agency. And he told the story. We actually talked about that on this show a couple months back, or a month back or so. Kind of an interesting little nugget there that we referred to the same story as Coach Payton. So I love that. I love that we're thinking along the same lines here and some stuff. But he made it seem like, to me, at least, this is just my vantage point, that he's maybe into the idea of one of these undrafted gems or one of these guys who's kind of flying under the radar right now, making the team, making an impact. I think that kind of is something that he takes pride in, of course, being able to identify and find these gems, coach them up. And obviously you've got, a system in place to where these guys can excel. You're going to run the ball a lot. You're going to give them opportunities. You're going to hopefully be more physical up front. I think it's an environment conducive for young players to succeed, which is a good thing for the Broncos.
It was Antonio Pittman out of Ohio State there. So, okay, all right, yeah. And we obviously know the legend of Pierre Thomas. That's always a name you think of, with the New Orleans Saints during that time when they had Drew Brees and Sean Payton. Pierre Thomas, just a guy who had this unbelievable effort, whether it be on special teams, whether it be on the offensive side about making plays. And look, I maybe he sees a vision for that. That's why, even before the NFL draft ended, he said he's super excited because he's like, usually you can find a Super Bowl running back hidden somewhere that doesn't go drafted. And so maybe Denver does have that on the roster. I'm with you there. If Javonte were not to be ready, I think you have Samaje Perine. The question is, who would the backups be behind him? Because I think if it was truly that point where Javonte wasn't ready, well, then I think you go with Samaje and you have to put some other guys in there. And I think if Javonte's healthy, I think you go Javonte and Samaje and then maybe throw in a guy every once in a while. But I think it'd really be split between those two guys in the offensive system. So could it be Tyler Beatty, who had, his first career touchdown last year on his first touch in the NFL? It's always a possibility, but then there's other competition. We talked about Emmanuel Wilson, Jaleel McLaughlin. I mean, what type of role might Tony Jones Jr. fit into this system? I mean, previously last week as well, Denver was set to have 9 running backs on the roster, but they cut Tyreek McAllister as well. So for me, I think maybe we have to ask ourselves this question. As big of a part of as Javonte is to this offense, and we talked about this last year, I think the moment he got injured, things got worse for the Broncos offensively. And they didn't have another running back really until they signed Latavius Murray that they could rely on. And that's where Melvin Gordon's struggles really impacted Denver even further. But now with maybe the roster makeup as is Denver's offense okay if Javonte isn't ready to go, right? Do you feel like the running back room right now with Samaje, maybe with somebody else there, do you feel like it's decent enough that it can get you through until he is ready to go?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I think I and maybe some listening feel the same way. I'm still a little skeptical on that. Not that I don't have faith in the coaching staff, not that I don't buy the players that are on the roster right now. It's just like you want to kind of see some of that stuff. I'd like to see some of these guys, maybe even in preseason play, right? Just to kind of get a feel for, hey, you give this guy a series or 2 of touches, and here's what he can do with that. Here's what he's capable of. Here's the kind of burst that he has. Here's what he can do if he's, taking some contact at or behind the line of scrimmage. You want to get a feel for these guys more so in order to be able to really understand, like, all right, get the regular season. This is what this player is going to bring to the table. I think what's really indicative of how this team, though, feels about the players at the position is the fact that Latavius Murray didn't re-sign with the Broncos, Cody, because I feel like that writing had been on the wall dating back to last December, right? Where you talk about the story of Latavius Murray reaching out to Sean Payton and kind of helping recruit him to Denver in the first place. The fact that he didn't sign on to this team, given the circumstances, given the situation with Javonte, given his obviously pretty deep understanding of where things are at and the coaching staff, I find that to be very interesting, right? In terms of where the Broncos are at of bringing in a veteran. They could have easily re-signed Latavius Murray, right? To a deal and just say, hey, why don't you come back, give us some veteran depth at the position. They obviously weren't overly interested in that, or Latavius wasn't interested given the plan for his potential role. So I find that to be a very telling situation when you look at where the Broncos are at. If you're out there saying, hey, they need to go after Dalvin Cook, or like me, I've written about Ezekiel Elliott a couple of times, like just these ideas of guys, if you want to stack at the position, talking about stacking the best possible names, maybe Sean Payton has been slowly but surely stacking at the position with guys that he really likes. Maybe he likes Demarie Crockett, Tyler Beatty, these other guys that were already there. I'll be fascinated to see as the preseason reps get divvied up between these guys, Cody, what they can do in this offensive scheme.
Sean Payton knows a thing or two because he's seen a thing or two here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Broncos Country, we're always eager for your thoughts. How are you feeling about the overall state of the running back position right now for the Broncos with the news that Javonte Williams is expected to be ready for the start of training camp? Broncos Country, if you're watching on YouTube, comment it down below. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting provider, make sure you send us a tweet on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. And for all you everyday listeners out there, here's what you can expect for tomorrow's episode of the show. Sayre and I, we sit down. We're going to talk about where we feel like the biggest strengths and the biggest weaknesses are for this Broncos football team after the NFL draft, after rookie minicamp, ahead of the start of OTAs and voluntary minicamp as well, which is coming up next week. We talk about that, and you get that on Locked On Broncos tomorrow.